Cale hunched against the cutting wind, his worn respirator mask wheezing with each labored breath. The toxic dust swirled around him, a constant companion in this wasteland that had once been a thriving suburb. He adjusted the straps of his scavenging pack, feeling the familiar weight of today's meager findings. A few copper wires, some salvageable circuitry, and half a canister of purification tablets. Hardly worth the risk of exposure, but necessary for survival. Another glorious day in paradise, he muttered to himself, his voice muffled behind the respirator. The sarcasm was a shield, one of many he'd built over the years of solitude. Cale couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken to another human being. 3 months? 4? Time blurred in the wastelands, marked only by the endless search for resources. His shelter came into view, a reinforced bunker partially buried beneath the ruins of what had once been a research facility. It wasn't much, but the thick walls kept out the worst of the dust storms, and the remaining tech infrastructure provided occasional power when he could scavenge enough fuel cells to run the generator. Home sweet home, he thought bitterly, keying in the access code and shoving open the heavy door. Inside, he methodically emptied his pack onto his workbench, categorizing each find with practiced efficiency. The water purifier gurgled in the corner, processing the day's collection into something marginally drinkable. He checked the readings, efficiency down another 2%. Soon he'd need replacement parts, or he'd be drinking poison like the desperate scavengers in the deeper ruins. As night fell, Cale plotted the next day's expedition. His finger traced a path on the faded map, lingering over an unexplored section where satellite imagery showed what might be the remains of a crashed transport vessel. Crash transports meant technology, maybe even preserved supplies if he was lucky. Worth investigating, despite the risk of other scavengers or malfunctioning security systems. The morning brought clearer skies than usual, a rare blessing in this dust-choked world. Cale moved quickly, wanting to take advantage of the improved visibility. 3 hours of careful navigation through the treacherous terrain brought him to the crash site. What he found stopped him in his tracks. This was no ordinary transport vessel. The sleek, opalescent hull reflected sunlight in ways no Earth technology could. The craft was small, perhaps 15 feet in length, with no visible seams or welds, as if it had been grown rather than built. Despite what must have been a violent impact, the structure appeared largely intact, embedded in the rust-colored earth like a pearl half buried in sand. Cale's mind raced through calculations. Alien technology was exceedingly rare, even in the chaotic aftermath of the collapse. The materials alone could sustain him for months, maybe years. The technological applications were incalculable. But the risks, unknown biohazards, security systems beyond his understanding, potential tracking by whoever or whatever had sent the craft. High risk, high reward, he muttered, weighing caution against necessity. Survival had always been a gamble in this world. He approached slowly, scanner in hand, probing for energy signatures or radiation warnings. Surprisingly, the readings were mild. Unusual heat patterns, but nothing immediately dangerous. A triangular door had opened in the side of the craft, whether from the impact or some automated system, Cale couldn't tell. He peered inside, the beam from his light revealing an interior unlike anything he'd ever encountered. Surfaces that seemed both solid and liquid, pulsing with subtle bioluminescence in shades of blue and violet. No sharp angles or hard edges. Everything flowed organically into the next component. And then he saw it. The cage. Suspended in the center of the cabin was a structure that could only be described as a cage, though it resembled no earthly prison. Crystalline rods spiraled in complex geometric patterns, containing a sphere of gently pulsing energy. The craftsmanship was breathtaking, each rod seemingly carved from a single piece of material that shifted colors as he moved around it. But it was what lay inside that made Cale's breath catch in his throat. A girl, or at least a being with a form similar enough to a human girl that his mind categorized her as such. She was small, perhaps reaching his chest if standing, with limbs too slender to be human, yet arranged in familiar patterns. Her skin was translucent, like frosted crystal that caught and diffused light, revealing shadowy suggestions of an alien anatomy beneath. Where a human would have hair, she possessed delicate crystalline filaments that shifted and moved slightly, even in the still air of the cabin. Her eyes were her most striking feature, like geodes cracked open to reveal interior constellations, points of light shifting within the faceted irises. She was curled into herself, those extraordinary eyes wide with terror as she stared at him. Kale stood frozen, his scavenger's instincts warring with something deeper, something he thought had been buried years ago beneath the necessary callousness of survival. The cage alone was a technological marvel. The materials, the energy containment field, the complex locking mechanism. Its value was incalculable. And its occupant, research facilities that still operated in the protected zones, would pay anything for such a specimen. But then she moved, uncurling slightly, one hand reaching toward him before withdrawing in fear. The gesture was so fundamentally vulnerable, so recognizable despite her alien appearance, that Kale felt something crack within him. "Hey," he said softly, the words sounding harsh and awkward after so long talking only to himself. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien girl tilted her head, filaments shifting like underwater plants in a gentle current. No comprehension in those starry eyes, but perhaps a lessening of fear. Kale slowly removed his pack, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He extracted his water canister. Purified water was his most precious resource, but something compelled him to share. He took a small sip first, then cautiously extended it toward the cage. "Water," he said, pointing to his mouth, then to her. "For drinking." She watched him intently, then edged closer to the boundary of her prison. As she approached, Kale noticed more details. The way her skin occasionally rippled with patterns like circuitry, the slight hover of her movement suggesting different gravitational adaptations. She examined the canister, then looked back at him, a question in her alien features. Kale found himself mimicking drinking again, feeling foolish yet determined to communicate. After several long moments, she cautiously extended a slender hand through a gap in the crystalline bars, the movement suggesting pain or difficulty. The containment field must have some property that discouraged contact, Kale realized. Her determination, despite the apparent discomfort, stirred something in him. She took the canister with surprising dexterity, studying it briefly before raising it to what Kale assumed was a mouth, a small vertical aperture that appeared as she tilted her head back. She drank tentatively, then with evident relief. When she returned the canister, their fingers briefly touched. Hers were cool and slightly textured, like touching living stone. Next, Kale offered a nutrient bar, the compressed, tasteless rations that kept scavengers alive. This she examined more cautiously, taking only a small portion after watching him demonstrate. Her reaction was unreadable, but she didn't reject it. Throughout this strange exchange, Kale found himself studying the cage with growing unease. The lock mechanism was like nothing he'd encountered, not mechanical or electronic as he understood them, but some hybrid of technology and biology. Complex patterns shifted across its surface, responding to some unknown algorithm. "Who put you in there?" he asked, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to voice the question. "And why?" Her response was unexpected. She straightened, fear giving way to a solemn intensity. One hand pressed against the energy field, causing visible discomfort that she ignored. With the other, she gestured outward, making a sweeping motion that encompassed the ship, the wasteland beyond, the sky above. Then she pointed to her eyes, made a clutching motion, and pointed to the cage. The meaning seemed clear enough, even across the species divide. Someone out there had seen her, wanted her, and imprisoned her. Kale sat back on his heels, considering. The smart play was obvious. Take what technology he could safely remove and leave. The cage was beyond his expertise. Tampering might trigger security systems, or worse. The girl wasn't his problem. Survival in this world meant making hard choices. And yet, I know what it's like, he found himself saying, being trapped. He studied the lock again, this time with different eyes. Not as a scavenger assessing value, but as someone looking for weaknesses. His years salvaging technology had given him an intuitive understanding of systems, even unconventional ones. This lock, for all its alliness, followed patterns. Patterns could be deciphered. Kale emptied his pack, assembling his tools with methodical precision. I'm going to try something, he told her, mimicking the action of opening with his hands. No promises. He began with passive scans, recording the shifting patterns of the lock, looking for repetitions or cycles. Hours passed as he worked, occasionally pausing to offer more water or small amounts of food, which she accepted with growing trust. The tension in her posture had eased somewhat, those extraordinary eyes watching his every move with an intelligence he could feel evaluating him. As darkness fell, Kale rigged lights and continued working. The lock's patterns had revealed themselves to be predictable sequences, complex but not random. Using modified tools and repurposed components from his own equipment, he created a device to mimic and interrupt the sequences. Each attempt brought him closer, the lock responding with changing patterns that he patiently recorded and analyzed. Near dawn, exhausted but determined, Kale made his final attempt. The device he'd built hummed against the lock, projecting the precisely calculated counter-sequence he'd derived. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like distant wind chimes, the crystalline bars began to shift, rotating and realigning themselves. The energy field flickered and dissolved. The cage opened. For a breathless moment, neither moved. The alien girl stood motionless, her strange eyes fixed on him, crystalline filaments undulating slowly. Kale remained kneeling, tools still in hand, suddenly uncertain of what he'd done. Their eyes met across the space between them, hers filled with stars, his worn by years of dust and solitude. Something passed between them, something that required no translation. Fear, gratitude, and something unnameable. Then she moved, a fluid motion that took her past him and toward the opening of the craft. She paused at the threshold, looking back once. Her form silhouetted against the dim light of approaching dawn, she made a gesture, hand to chest, then extended toward him, before slipping away into the wasteland beyond. Kale remained kneeling beside the empty cage, tools scattered around him, feeling oddly hollow. He'd sacrificed valuable equipment to free her, acted against his own interests for reasons he couldn't articulate. Yet somehow, watching the sunrise through the craft's opening, he felt a strange peace amidst his confusion. "What the hell did I just do?" he finally muttered, gathering his remaining tools. The question echoed in the empty craft, unanswered. The days that followed carried a disquieting sense of unreality. Kale returned to his routines, scavenging, purifying water, maintaining his shelter, but found himself distracted, his thoughts repeatedly returning to the alien girl and his inexplicable choice to free her. He found himself scanning the horizon in the direction she had disappeared, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the wind or shifting ruins. His shelter seemed smaller somehow, its familiar confines suddenly claustrophobic. The silence that had been his constant companion now felt heavy, laden with questions. He'd taken only minimal salvage from the alien craft, his usual thoroughness abandoned in the strange emotional aftermath of the encounter. The few components he'd collected were unlike anything he'd seen, materials that seemed to adapt to their surroundings, technology that blurred the line between mechanical and organic. At night, he dreamed of starry eyes and crystalline skin, of cages both literal and metaphorical. He woke feeling restless, driven by an emotion he couldn't name. "You're losing it, Kale," he told himself one morning, voice echoing in the empty bunker. "One weird encounter, and you're acting like a character in those pre-collapse novels." He gestured dismissively at the small shelf of salvaged books, romantic adventures and science fiction that he occasionally read to stave off the crushing boredom of isolation. The water purifier chugged and sputtered, the efficiency indicator now flashing red. Another week, maybe less, before it failed completely. Cale inventoried his supplies grimly. Not enough to trade for a replacement system. He'd need to venture into the deeper ruins, risk the automated defenses and toxic hotspots to find the necessary components. Focus on survival, he muttered. That's all that matters. Yet as he traced potential scavenging routes on his map, he found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the location of the alien craft, marked with an X. Had she survived out there? The wasteland was merciless even to those adapted to Earth's environment, for being clearly evolved for different conditions. He forced the thought away. Not his problem, not his responsibility. 3 days later, Cale noticed the first anomaly. Returning from a disappointing scavenging run, he found the air above his shelter unusually clear during what should have been the afternoon dust storm. A perfect circle of calm centered on his bunker, while the familiar toxic clouds swirled around the perimeter. He stood at the edge of this inexplicable bubble, watching dust particles hit some invisible barrier and slide around it. Atmospheric anomaly, he reasoned aloud, though he'd never encountered anything similar. Probably related to the weather patterns shifting east. The next day, he found a smoothly polished stone near his water cache. It was unlike the surrounding geology, a deep blue-violet material that seemed to capture light and hold it. When he picked it up, it felt slightly warm despite the chill air, and weighed less than its size suggested it should. Coincidence, he told himself. Yet he slipped the stone into his pocket rather than adding it to his collection of potentially valuable materials. The third anomaly was impossible to dismiss. Returning from checking his perimeter sensors, Cale caught a scent so out of place it stopped him mid-stride. Not the usual chemical tang of the wasteland, nor the metallic smell of approaching storms. This was floral, organic, alive. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him standing foolishly in the dust, inhaling deeply in search of something that seemed increasingly like a hallucination. Perhaps that's what it was. The isolation, the constant stress of survival, the strange encounter with the alien. His mind could be creating sensory experiences to compensate for the deprivation of this barren existence. It wasn't unheard of among lone scavengers. The line between adaptation and breakdown was thin out here. This explanation might have satisfied him if not for the incident with the security drone. Outdated but still dangerous, the automated security systems from before the collapse occasionally activated, their targeting systems corrupted but lethal. Cale had learned to recognize the distinctive hum seconds before they appeared, giving him precious moments to take cover. He was crossing an exposed stretch of rubble when he heard it, the rising whine of a drone preparation sequence. There was no cover nearby, nowhere to hide. Cale dropped flat, knowing it was futile but driven by instinct. The drone would have thermal imaging. Lying still would only make him an easier target. The whine peaked, indicating target acquisition. Cale tensed, waiting for the searing pain of an energy weapon. It never came. Instead, there was a strange harmonic tone, a flash of light that wasn't quite light, and the drone dropped from the sky like a stone, landing 10 feet from where he lay. Its systems sparked and went dark, the ordinarily resilient machinery completely dead. Cale approached cautiously, examining the drone with expert eyes. The damage pattern was unlike anything he'd encountered. No entry points, no burn marks, just a total systemic failure that had somehow affected even the isolated backup power cells. "This isn't possible," he whispered, touching the cool metal casing. Something had neutralized a military-grade security system with technology beyond his understanding. Something had protected him, or someone. The possibility he'd been avoiding crystallized into certainty. He wasn't alone. She was still out there, watching, following, helping. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, a strange warmth spread through his chest, an emotion so long absent he barely recognized it. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. That evening, as he sorted his findings, Cale discovered a small object nestled among the components in his pack. He was certain it hadn't been there when he'd set out that morning. The object was exquisite, an intricate, delicate structure of shining metallic filaments woven into a form that resembled nothing he recognized, yet somehow suggested motion and protection simultaneously. When he touched it, it emitted a soft pulse of light before going dormant. Not threatening, but clearly responsive. A message? A gift? Cale turned it over in his hands, marveling at its construction. The material was similar to the cage that had imprisoned the alien girl, but repurposed, transformed into something beautiful rather than confining. He placed it carefully on his workbench, then, after a moment's hesitation, spoke aloud to the empty room. "Thank you," he said, feeling simultaneously foolish and compelled. "For the drone. And, whatever this is." Only silence answered him, yet somehow it felt like a different quality of silence than before. That night, lying on his narrow bunk, Cale asked the darkness the question that had been building since the encounter. "Why were you in that cage? Who are you running from?" The darkness offered no answers, but for the first time in years, Cale fell asleep with the sense that he wasn't completely alone. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Cale never caught sight of the alien girl, but evidence of her presence accumulated. His failing water purifier mysteriously repaired itself, now producing water of extraordinary purity that seemed to carry subtle, energizing properties. A patch of bioluminescent fungi appeared near his shelter. Cautious testing revealed them to be not only edible but remarkably nutritious, temporarily enhancing his senses after consumption. Most dramatically, an old positioning device he'd salvaged began displaying strange constellations alongside the familiar star patterns, with a single point pulsing rhythmically in a pattern too regular to be natural. It reminded him of old maritime navigational beacons. From historical archives, a deliberate signal meant to guide. Cale found himself talking aloud more frequently, addressing the unseen presence he now felt certain was monitoring him. "The water tastes better than anything I've had in years," he would comment while filling his canister. "Though your delivery methods are a bit creepy. Ever consider knocking?" No response came, of course, but the one-sided conversations filled a void he hadn't acknowledged. He began leaving small offerings, items he thought might interest her. A rare piece of metal with unusual conductive properties. A perfect quartz crystal he'd found embedded in concrete. A datapad containing visual archives of Earth before the collapse, focusing on natural landscapes and art. Each disappeared overnight, replaced sometimes with small alien artifacts whose purpose he could only guess at. One appeared to purify air in a small radius. Another seemed to strengthen materials it was attached to, technology that should have been incomprehensible, yet designed to interface with human tools and needs. "You're studying us," he realized aloud one evening, examining a modified circuit that now operated at impossible efficiency. "Learning how things work here, adapting your technology to fit." The question of why remained unanswered, but Cale was beginning to form theories. The cage suggested she was valuable, hunted. Perhaps she was hiding, using Earth's devastated environment as cover while she, what? Prepared? Recovered? Waited for rescue? Whatever her purpose, she had chosen to reveal herself to him, albeit indirectly, to help him. The realization shifted something fundamental in Cale's outlook. For years, survival had been enough. The daily struggle to continue existing in a world that offered little reason to do so. Now, curiosity and something approaching purpose had awakened in him. Then disaster struck. A section of unstable structure collapsed while Cale was exploring a promising ruin, burying him beneath rubble. He managed to free himself, but not before sustaining serious injuries. A deep gash in his leg, possible fractured ribs, and a head wound that left him dizzy and disoriented. The journey back to his shelter was a nightmare of pain and determination. By the time he dragged himself through the door, fever had set in, his wounds showing the telltale signs of infection. In lucid moments, Cale knew his situation was dire. Without proper medical supplies, infection in this environment was often a death sentence. He collapsed onto his bunk, consciousness flickering. Through the haze of fever, he thought he heard movement, felt a cool presence nearby. Gentle hands turned him, examined his wounds. Something cold and soothing was applied to the gash in his leg, a luminescent gel that numbed the fiery pain on contact. "You're here," he murmured, struggling to focus on the blurred figure beside him. Actually here. Consciousness slipped away before he could see more. When Cale awoke, the fever had broken. Sunlight streamed through the narrow ventilation shaft, indicating he'd been unconscious for hours. The pain had subsided to a dull throb, and when he carefully examined his injuries, he found them covered with a thin layer of translucent, slightly luminescent material that seemed to be actively healing the damaged tissue. Beside his bunk lay an object he'd never seen before, a dark, organically shaped device with no visible buttons or screen. It resembled a smooth stone with subtle contours that fit perfectly when he cautiously picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, Cale gasped. It transmitted not images or sounds, but direct emotional impressions that bloomed in his mind with startling clarity. Fear, raw and disorienting, the terror of awakening in captivity among strange beings. Determination, surviving alone in an alien environment, observing, learning, adapting. Gratitude, profound and multi-layered, for the simple act of opening a cage, of choosing compassion over opportunity. The emotional narrative continued, conveying intention behind the gifts. Not random acts, but a careful observation of needs, a deliberate reciprocity. Most profoundly, Cale understood the invitation contained in the pulsing light on the positioning device. A meeting point, a deliberate choice to move beyond observation to direct contact. As the flow of impressions faded, Cale sat in stunned silence, processing what he'd experienced. The device had bridged the gap between their species more effectively than any verbal language could have. He understood her now, not all details of her situation or origin, but the essential emotional reality of her experience. And she, through her observation, seemed to understand him as well. The pulsing light on the positioning device now seemed urgently meaningful. He checked the coordinates, a location several days' journey from his shelter, in a region he'd never explored. The terrain would be challenging, especially in his injured state, but the alien healing technology was accelerating his recovery at an astonishing rate. For the first time in years, Cale faced a decision not solely dictated by survival. The smart choice would be to remain, to continue benefiting from the alien technology while maintaining safe distance. After all, direct contact brought unknown risks. Yet as he watched the rhythmic pulse of light on the device, felt the lingering echo of the emotions the dark object had transmitted, Cale recognized that something fundamental had shifted. Mere survival no longer seemed sufficient. The connection he'd glimpsed between two beings from entirely different worlds, drawn together by a simple act of compassion, offered something he'd forgotten was possible. Meaning. 3 days later, with his wounds healed enough for travel, Cale packed essential supplies. The journey would take him beyond the territories he knew, beyond the safety of familiar landmarks and cataloged dangers. The positioning device would be his guide, leading him into the unknown. As he secured his shelter and prepared to depart, Cale found himself addressing the unseen presence one last time. "I'm coming," he said simply. "I hope that's what you want." The wasteland stretched before him, harsh and unforgiving as always, yet somehow different now. The toxic dust clouds parted mysteriously as he traveled, the worst of the environmental hazards seeming to fade from his path. Magnetic disturbances that should have disrupted his equipment passed without effect. At night, the stars shone with unusual clarity, the alien constellations on his device aligning with patterns visible only to him through the enhanced perception granted by the bioluminescent fungi he now carried. The landscape itself began to change as he neared the coordinates. Vegetation appeared, sparse at first, then increasingly prevalent. Not the hardy mutated species that had adapted to the toxic environment, but plants with an otherworldly quality, their structures similar to Earth flora, yet fundamentally different in coloration and arrangement. The air grew clearer, the perpetual metallic taste of the wasteland giving way to something fresher. Finally, as the 5th day of travel drew to a close, Kale crested a ridge and stopped in astonishment. Below him lay what could only be described as an oasis, a perfect circle of vibrant life amid the desolation, perhaps half a mile in diameter. Crystal clear water pooled in the center, surrounded by vegetation that pulsed with subtle bioluminescence. The air shimmered slightly at the perimeter, suggesting some kind of containment field or atmospheric manipulation. And, standing at the edge of the pool, waiting, was the alien girl. Kale descended slowly, taking in her transformed appearance. No longer the frightened prisoner, she stood tall and confident. Her crystalline skin glowed with health, patterned with intricate circuitry-like designs that shifted subtly with her breathing. She wore a simple garment that seemed to be made of the same material as some of the artifacts she'd left him, functional but beautifully crafted. Her filament-like hair moved in patterns that suggested emotion or communication, forming complex geometries before settling into gentle waves. As he approached, her extraordinary eyes fixed on him, recognition evident in the way the starry points within them brightened. The fear that had dominated their first encounter was gone, replaced by calm assurance and what he thought might be anticipation. They stood facing each other, separated by only a few feet of earth that seemed to span galaxies. No words passed between them. None would have been adequate. Instead, communication flowed through gesture and expression, through the shared context of their strange connection. A tentative step forward, a tilt of the head, the slight reaching of a hand, mirrored by the other. Then she extended both hands, cradling something between them. It was small, exquisitely crafted from woven light filaments and crystal fragments similar to her hair. It emitted a soft glow and the faintest melody, almost below the threshold of hearing. Kale hesitated, then carefully accepted the offering. The moment it touched his palms, he understood this was no ordinary gift. The object resonated with his consciousness, but unlike the dark device that had transmitted her emotions, this creation reflected his own experiences back to him. He felt the echo of his own isolation mirrored in her people's history of loss or displacement. He experienced the extraordinary weight and meaning of his simple act of liberation, magnified through the lens of her culture, where freedom might be sacred or exceedingly rare. He felt the depth of her gratitude, not merely for herself, but as a symbol of hope, perhaps communicated back to her kind. Most profoundly, he experienced the deep resonance of loneliness between two entirely different beings, finding a moment of pure connection amid universal desolation. The emotional impact was overwhelming. The protective cynicism Kale had cultivated over years of harsh survival cracked completely under the weight of this shared understanding. Tears welled unexpectedly, spilling down cheeks long since unused to such expressions. It was a release of emotions he hadn't permitted himself to acknowledge, let alone express, for longer than he could remember. The alien girl observed silently, her geode eyes reflecting complete comprehension without judgment. No words were necessary in this moment of profound connection, this wordless acknowledgement of their bond. The gift of shared emotion and the collapse of Kale's emotional walls, hung between them in the crystalline air of the oasis, transforming both giver and receiver in ways neither could have anticipated. In that perfect moment of understanding, standing amid impossible life in a devastated world, Kale realized he had received something far more valuable than technology or resources. She had given him back his humanity, the capacity to feel deeply, to connect beyond the basic imperatives of survival. And in return, his simple act of compassion had given her something equally profound, proof that even in a broken world, kindness could exist between the most different of beings. The alien girl's filaments shifted into a new configuration, capturing the fading light of sunset in patterns that seemed to express emotions beyond human naming. Kale stood before her, tears still streaming, the gift cradled in his hands continuing to resonate with their shared understanding. Neither moved to leave or speak, content to exist in this moment of connection that transcended the vast differences between their worlds. In the gathering twilight of an Earth most had abandoned hope for, two beings from different stars had found something precious: recognition in the other's eyes. Whatever would come tomorrow, dangers, discoveries, or departures, this moment of pure understanding would remain, a testament to the possibility that compassion might be the most universal language of all.